Hello guys, welcome back to Engineers Code. Long time I have not uploaded videos on operating system playlist because I was a bit busy in making dynamic programming videos as well as with some office work. So in this video we will discuss about the boot process, and before that let's just quickly recap what we have covered till now. We have covered software interrupts, about signal function and how interrupt is being handled by the signal vector table, how we can modify it, and also we have discussed about the different architectures of various components such as the memory and the cache memory, the ROM, the RAM, and how interrupt cycle works, how the instruction cycle works, and other stuffs, right? So if you haven't watched these videos, please feel free to watch these videos because all these videos are related to each other and are very important for your knowledge about the operating system. It is the base of the knowledge that you are going to learn, and after that more complex topics are going to be covered. So if you haven't watched this video, it will be incomplete and you will not be able to understand most of the stuffs, right? So in this video we are going to discuss about the boot process. So what is a boot process? So as written in here, it is the set of operations that are done by the device, including the initialization of the hardware and loading of the operating system. Basically, whenever you start your device, whether it is a phone or your laptop, what happens is that you press the power button, and after the power button is pressed, it takes some amount of time, for example 5 seconds to 10 seconds, and then prompts you with the system login. So during that 5 to 10 seconds, something is happening in the background. You are only shown the logo of your device, but something is happening in the background. That is what is called the boot process, in which all the initialization part and the loading part of the operating system happens. So in this video we will cover about that in depth, right? So let's just start. So whenever you press the switch of your laptop or phone, a power supply is being generated either from the battery or from the power source, any other power source, to the motherboard. So motherboard is something which is the hub of all the hardware components. It has the CPU core, it has all the wires which connects and has the communication capacity between all the hardwares present in your laptop or device, right? So I hope you have heard about motherboard. Most of you have crashed your motherboard in your starting years, but just research about what is a motherboard, right? Basically it is the mother of all board, as the name suggests. It is the mother of all the hardware components on circuits, right? So, and has direct access to all the hardwares including ROM. So that is why we can argue that the software that are present in ROM are present in the motherboard. It has a CPU socket which contains the CPU. So a power supply is generated to the motherboard, and the motherboard then initializes the firmware, or that is called the BIOS. So what is a firmware? So there are either a thing is a software or a hardware or a firmware. So software is something that is abstracted from the hardware using some API calls, right? Hardware is something that performs instruction based on instructions provided by the software, right? It performs certain task provided the instruction is being provided by the software. And what is a firmware? A firmware is also a type of software, but it is stored in ROM and has direct access to all the components using wire connections. So it is stored in the circuit, right, and is connected to all the hardwares by a wire, right? So that is what we call as firmware. So BIOS is a type of firmware which is responsible for all the initialization and the tests, right, and loading the other stuffs. So BIOS full form is basic input output, right? So what is the other things other than BIOS? It is UEFI and grub. So UEFI is basically something, whenever you start your laptop, what happens is whenever you press some keys F1 or F12, what happens is that a menu or graphical user interface is prompted to you, in which you can control it by either mouse or by the keyboard. So that ability is provided to you by UEFI. So BIOS is old and it is legacy code, right? But UEFI is the new version of it, or not new version of it, but it is a different thing, but alternative to BIOS, right? And obviously the grub is used by Linux distributions or the Linux operating system. And what is the difference between grub and BIOS and UEFI? That grub can support multiple file systems, right? Obviously there are other differences, but it is not important in this video. Just there is a firmware that is responsible for all the test and initialization, and after that test it finds the code which is responsible to load the kernel to the operating system, right? So it is responsible, the firmware is responsible. In this case it is BIOS, right? And why it is BIOS, we will discuss it in the later part of the video, right? So what does the BIOS does? It does all the hardware initialization, such as the CPU, the memory devices, etc. As my laptop contains the touch bar, so it is also hardware, right? All the touch bar and touchpad, obviously the keyboard, the internal keyboard, it initializes all that thing, right? And it performs a power on self test, or what we called as post. So what are the roles of post? So post is, it is the first role is obviously to check the integrity of the CPU or the central processing unit, right? Its component are ALU and the CU, right? It checks the integrity of it and whether it is performing as expected or not. After that, it checks the RAM and all the memories, all the storage devices, and it checks the graphic card and handles error. If any error is prompted, it handles that error as well, right? So after all the tests and initialization is done, what happens is that the BIOS or the firmware that you have chosen, whether it is UEFI or grub or BIOS, it finds the MBR. So what is an MBR? MBR is basically a data structure that is usually stored in the first section of your disk, right? What is a disk? It is the storage device, right? Which of your laptop or your phone or any other bootable device such as pen drive. You have heard about bootable devices, right? You have most of you have made the pen drive bootable, right? So it has a MBR or other partition schemes like Git partition schemes or GPT, right? So we will discuss about the differences here. So but it is a data structure which contains the bootloader code, the partition table, and the MBR signature for MBR. It is different for GPT, which contains a global table which is used for identifying the partition disk, and it can contain more segments or more partition tables other than the MBR, right? It is probably more in size, some 16,000 bits or something, I don't remember. But in this case we are talking about MBR, which is basically a data structure that stores the primary bootloader code. So what is a primary bootloader code? What is a bootloader code? A bootloader code is the code segment or the code which is responsible for loading the kernel to the main memory. As simple as that, right? So if anyone asks you what is a bootloader code, what will you say? It is the code that is responsible for loading the kernel into the main memory. Now there are two types of bootloader, the primary bootloader code and the secondary bootloader code. So the role of the primary bootloader code is just to find the location of the secondary bootloader code and transfers the control to it. The role of it is just like that. And the secondary bootloader code's role is to actually load the kernel into the main memory. I hope you know about kernel, right? I've discussed about kernel in depth, about the architecture of it, how kernel works, what is the user mode and the kernel stack, all the data structures that the kernel uses. Please, watch that video because it is very important to understand how the kernel actually works, right? The different types of kernel, different architectures that are used in the market, right? So the secondary bootloader is responsible for loading the kernel into the main memory. So MBR in this case, since BIOS is a legacy code, it uses MBR. But the modern firmwares like the UEFI and grub uses the GPT table or the Git partition table because it can support multiple partitions with larger sizes, right? And is obviously faster and is more effective or efficient, right? Other than the MBR. So for example, whenever you try to create what we call as a virtual disk or something like that in Windows, you must have been prompted, if you haven't, just try it, right? In your local disk D or E, just try to create a virtual disk, right? Then it will ask you, or the system will ask you, whether you want an MBR or GPT, right? So that's when you can understand what is it. So it initializes a data structure which contains the partition information of that disk, how the disk has been partitioned, right? I hope you know about partition. What is a partition, right? If you don't, please research it. This video is not relevant to it, right? So since we are talking about MBR here, so MBR has a size of 512 bytes, right? So 446 bytes is reserved for the primary bootloader code. It is a small segment of code that is just responsible to load the secondary bootloader, right? So where is the secondary bootloader? The information is stored in the partition table, right? So what happens is that the partition table contains table which has all the information about the partition. One such table has a flag called active flag. When the table has an active flag, it states that it has the location of the volume boot record. So the main or the second stage bootloader is stored in the volume boot record, which contains the secondary stage bootloader, right? So the partition table, in the table which has the active flag, is used to locate that secondary bootloader. So the primary bootloader code locates the secondary bootloader code, which information is stored in the partition table, which has a size of 64 bytes, right? And obviously the MBR, obviously you know about data structure, right? What is a data structure? So master boot record is kind of a data structure which is used to store all this information, right? And obviously the MBR signature, which is used for validation. So whenever your signature is being used, why it is used for? It is used for validating you, right? Same goes with MBR. If the signature is corrupted, then the BIOS will not initialize with this particular bootloader code, right? So it is used for verification and validation, which has a size of 2 bytes. So after the partition schemes and partition table is being read and the secondary bootloader is being loaded, then it loads the storage device, and it takes the information from the partition table and loads the storage devices in your what we call as device or laptop or phone, right? Because the information on the partition schemes are there in the partition table, right? So after it stores, the secondary bootloader has the control in it, right? Now the secondary bootloader role is just not to load the kernel into the RAM. Whenever you have a dual boot in your laptop, I hope you know about dual boot, right? Dual boot is something in which you can have multiple operating system in your computer, and you can, whenever you start your laptop or start your device, you can choose to go to multiple operating system based on your requirement, right? So that is a dual boot. So you can have Windows as well as Linux in your laptop, right? So what happens when the GUI is being presented to you? Now the control is with the volume boot record, right? What we call as VBR, which has the secondary bootloader. Whenever you click other bootloaders that are present, for example, the Linux bootloader, and you are currently in Windows VBR, so what it does is that it performs chain loading, which is the process of transferring control from itself to the other bootloader that you have chosen. So that is called what we call as chain loading. You need to remember the word chain loading, right? So it can perform chain loading as well. Now, after the kernel is loaded into the main memory, I hope you know what are the components of kernel. The kernel then initializes all the important. Before that, what is kernel? A kernel is a software, right? So it must be a process. So it is the main process or the main thread of the operating system, and its process ID is generally 1. So every process has a process ID 1, right? We will discuss about that in depth. What is a process, what are threads in the next video probably. What are the stages of a process. But what is a kernel? A kernel is basically the main core software of the operating system. So it initializes all the user stack, user mode and the kernel mode, all the background processes and all the startup processes that are required by your laptop or operating system to operate, the graphical user interface, the other processes that are required. For example, what we call as the drivers, all the drivers and all the other stuffs are being loaded by the kernel. It has an init function in it, and after all the processor, all the essential services and processes are started, then the system login is prompted to you. And after the system login is prompted to you, you authenticate yourself, and after that it gives you the graphical user interface in which you can access all the user space processes such as my Chrome, my WhatsApp app, my settings app, all the other stuffs like the terminal, which is through which you can control and send commands, right? So that is what is all about boot process. See how all this stuff happens in the span of 5 to 10 seconds. Isn't it interesting, right? Operating system is obviously interesting, very much interesting if you learn it in a better way and in a more in-depth way. Right? You must know about your devices, right? At least up to this level. You must know how it works. After that, if you want to make an operating system, then you can study more about it, right? But other than that, this amount of knowledge is sufficient for you, for your general purpose use. And how, if you want to know how software is working, and how it is operating with the operating system, this amount of knowledge is good for you. But if you want to write a code, then you need to know all the commands, that we are going to discuss on the next videos. What are the types of system calls, how system call we can code in C, the different types of system calls that we can code. And about we will also be discussing about the process and thread, and about scheduling as well. We will code the scheduling algorithms, different scheduling algorithms, and I'm planning to code an operating system, overall operating system in JavaScript, right? In which I will make you visualize how an operating system is working, how a process is segmented, and the pages are loaded, how page fault occurs, all the other stuffs, how RAM interacts with the process, and how kernel space, the user space and the kernel space works. Let's see what I can do. But I hope you got an idea of what is a boot process, right? So if you have any doubt, feel free to comment it. And if you guys have enjoyed this video, please subscribe and like. I am making a lot of effort to create these videos. It will be a lot of support for me, and and thank you guys for the support that you gave already. And don't forget to share with your friends, to share the knowledge, and obviously real knowledge has been provided to you in compared to the other so-called influencers, right? I don't want to talk about them, but thank you guys for watching this video. Wait for the next video, and bye bye.